For this episode of Speaking of Suicide, I'm speaking to Sandy Clunas. We're doing things a bit differently because Sandy has his own podcast series focusing on men and mental health called The After Hours Lounge. We're going to hear all about Sandy's podcast shortly, but what we're going to do is kind of simulcast, for want of a better word, this episode both on Speaking of Suicide and on The After Hours Lounge. The format is probably going to be a bit more familiar to the Speaking of Suicide regulars, but I'm sure we can all just roll with it. Sandy comes from Nairn, up in the north of Scotland originally, which is where we're chatting today. But at 18, he left Nairn, left Scotland, went off to become a windsurfing instructor in Australia, then travelled the world working and windsurfing. On the surface of it, Sandy was living the dream. So what could he possibly have to say about how to deal with mental health challenges? Well, that's exactly what we're going to find out today. As always, Speaking of Suicide comes with a bit of a word of warning. The podcast is designed to be frank, open and honest. We can go into some difficult and dark places. We certainly don't always talk about suicide, but if you're listening to this and it does trigger tough thoughts in you, remember you can press pause and you can always get some help. I'm Penny Stewart and this episode has been sponsored by D&D Paving Limited, so a big thanks to them for their ongoing support for what we're doing. And finally, Speaking of Suicide is made in collaboration with and in support of Mikey's Line. So if you do need someone to talk to, I'll give you their details at the end of the podcast. Got all that bit out of the way.
That bit's done. That's always the difficult bit, isn't it? Always the difficult bit.
And then we get to chat. Sandy, I do want to come on and talk about the podcast because it's a really important part of what you're now doing in your life. But before we get to there, I think we should start here in Nairn.
Yep.
For anyone who doesn't know Nairn, it's a little town that sits right on the coast of the Moray Firth, or the Moray coast, and from where we're sitting, it's sort of a couple of stone throws to the beach.
Yep.
Was it inevitable that you were going to grow up and get into water sports? Tell me how that all came about.
To be honest, despite being, looking outside now, we're sitting in my mum's garden and it's a beautiful sunny day and you're wondering, well, yeah, this does seem like a paradise. But as we said before we hit record, it's not always like this. But there always was something about the ocean. I don't know whether it's my name, Sandy. There are connotations to the beach there. And growing up, unfortunately at 30 years old, I'm now slightly follically challenged. But, I was always the one with kind of long blonde hair and I looked a bit like a surfer and we did go on these water sports holidays as a youngster, and there are pictures of me windsurfing at kind of 8-10 years old, and I was never a sporty child. I grew up with a lot of hearing problems, so I really struggled with group sports, so I never played football, never played rugby, never did anything like that, quit every sport I ever started. But I do remember going windsurfing, and I was the only one that was lifting the sail up and going along, and everyone else was like really struggling with it, and the instructors were like, whoa, and even all the teachers, but it was always in my mind, and it was the only sport I'd ever done where I felt, I might be good at this. It's the only activity really,
So where did the big dream come from to leave here? And I'm assuming it was the big dream, leave here, go and kind of travel the world and become a windsurfing instructor.
It came quite late. We went on one holiday. We went to Turkey twice, one year and then the year after, I think 2005, 2006. So I was 14 and 15. And the second year we went, the kids club group we were in, whatever, we did this thing, and the instructors gave me a foot strap at the end to say like how cool, whatever. And I think it was like the Future Instructor Award. So I won that, and then it's funny going back now, I remember that my first couple of seasons as an instructor, Mum said to me, she was like, "This is you were going to do this." She was like, "From you when you were 14, you were going to do this." But I got sort of through sixth year. I'd applied to university to do film and media. I'm very passionate about films as well, films and movies and everything like that. And then I don't know, the penny dropped, and I was like, no, this isn't what I want to do. I don't want to keep doing the exams. I don't want to do this. I want to go. So I did a load of research and I found these 0 to hero courses in Australia, 6 weeks, and they train you and then you become an instructor.
And was it the dream? Was it all fantastic?
To be honest, yeah, it was, because it was what I wanted to do. It was my dream. I think it's very easy to say live in the dream, but everyone's dream is so vastly different. And for me, that was the dream. The dream was to be abroad, getting paid, to teach people to windsurf, living in the sun and having a good time. But I was getting paid next to nothing. I was living in staff accommodation with 30 other people with toilets that didn't work and flooding floors and, you know, all this stuff. Getting fed 3 meals a day, that's brilliant. Free food, but it was staff food. Sometimes you turn the plate upside down and the food doesn't move, you know. Some people go, I couldn't live like that. But for me, that was the dream, because I was going windsurfing in Greece or Egypt or Brazil every day in the sun. I was like, for me, it was my dream, yeah.
So why aren't you doing that now? Bring us to what went wrong, or what was the turning point? Because things have changed now. Things have
massively changed, yeah. So there was this thing, I'm 30 now. Did my first season at 18 in 2010 and did my last season in 2017. So I'm going to say I was 26. It is funny, when I look at season airs and all my friends that did it and even the wider industry, there is something about when you get to that 26, 27, everyone just has a bit of a meltdown and goes, right, it's so ingrained in you that this is really weird. I was on another podcast a couple of days ago and all about seasons and stuff, and the big thing I talked about is a lot of guests and things on seasons, there's this thing where they kind of make a joke to all the staff and say, oh, so when are you going to get a proper job then? When are you going to get a proper job? And nothing grates me quite as much as that question, because what is a proper job? And without that job I was doing out there, these people wouldn't be able to spend thousands of pounds to go out on the holiday to do the thing they love the most and learn from me. So how isn't it a proper job? But after a certain point, I think that question starts getting into your head and you go, when am I going to get a proper job? When am I going to get a proper job? So to be honest, I went out on that last season having already had a discussion with Loch Inch about taking on a role as operations manager there. And I thought about it and then eventually I swayed towards, all right, I'll go do one last summer. But even during that summer, I'd kind of realised I was like, I'd hit the roof. I was the highest level instructor qualification you can be in windsurfing. I had industry sponsors. I was, everything, you know, but I was like, I'm not, nothing's growing from here. There's nowhere for me to go in my path. I realised, right, I probably need to come back to the UK and get a proper job, I suppose, and how wrong I was. But looking back on it now, it was the best possible thing. And I think that's something with mental health, maybe I'm jumping ahead and I apologise if I am, but you often think, oh, that was so bad and it was so horrible and everything like that. But you learn the most, and it sounds so cliche, but you truly learn the most and get the most out of your worst experiences, in my opinion. And that first year and a half when I came back to live in the UK were the worst years of my life. 2018, 2019, worst years of my life.
And I want to do a bit of a dive into that. Just before we do, the phrase proper job snagged me and is an interesting one. And I think I heard you talking about this recently in one of your podcasts, where you were talking a bit about how we're defined by what we do, or we allow ourselves to be defined by what we do in life. And do you think that's what it was for you? You were worrying about what other people thought about what you did in life?
Yeah, 100%. I think, and obviously I can't speak to it from the other perspective, but I think it is a big problem for men, is that because we want this status, we want this power, we want people to look at us as successful and all this. And I was very successful in that lane of being a windsurfer and a windsurfing instructor. And then I came back to the UK and I felt like I was losing that side of my identity. And I went, I've got nothing else. I don't have a house. I don't have hundreds of thousands of pounds in my bank. I don't have a sports car. I don't have all this stuff. So when I walk into a pub in the UK, I'm not, oh, there's Sandy the instructor. I saw him on the water earlier. Oh, he taught me last week. He's amazing. That doesn't happen. I walk into a pub and I'm just some other guy. And without being egotistical or anything, in Greece, I was a big fish in an extremely small pond. The tiniest pond you can imagine. But there, I had this thing. about me that I loved and I was good at, and all these people knew me. And year on year, the guests would come back and they'd bring new people. Oh, this is Sandy. Yes, we got a good instructor. We got Sandy. My whole identity was tied to that part of me. And when I came back, that disappeared. The remarkable thing is, when I left, I took a job, for perspective, I took a job still in the windsurfing industry, managing a centre on the south coast of England in a fairly wealthy, well-to-do area. And the remarkable thing was, the thing I get there versus when I'd come up here and spend a few days with my mum and my friends, it felt remarkably different. So even being in the same country, coming up here, I felt less stressed to be successful or anything like that. But I think being down there and being exposed to the wealth down there and all the people who have these things to talk about, I just felt a bit empty and a bit lost, to be honest.
Yeah, I can entirely relate to that. I chose, elected to leave the BBC after being in the BBC for 25 years.
Yeah.
And that stepping away, it was massive. I thought, what am I going to say when people ask me what I do?
Yeah.
when I've had all these years being able to go, oh, I work for the BBC.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
Although I was, it was the right move, and I was really positive about making that move. At the same time, it sat heavily, and these things do sit heavily. So let's come back to that difficult year, if you don't mind us going there.
No. I'll happily talk about anything. Yeah.
So let's talk about that difficult year, which by the sound of it was in part kind of a product of this massive change, change of status, change of what is it that you do type, scenarios. So where did you end up in terms of that difficult year? What did it look like in your head?
Well, the funny thing is, it all started really well. If anyone remembers back, 2018, the weather in the UK was ridiculous. It was outrageously sunny. I came back, took this job in the UK, and was like, oh, here we go, grim summer in the UK, my first summer in the UK since 2009. And it was amazing, and it was so sunny and just incredible. And I'd taken on this new job, and because it's all new, you kind of look, it's like the honeymoon phase, isn't it? So I looked at it and I was like, oh, this is brilliant, and things like that. And then as I got towards sort of September, October 2018, I feel like something just started to click in me. Another thing, a difficult thing is my best friend, who I then started living with, we got a flat together right on the coast, right on the beach, literally right on the beach. He got a really good new job with a really, really cool company. And I went, oh, what am I doing? Someone else, my best mate, who I did seasons with for years, and we're coming up and this, and he's just taken this new level. And I was like, I haven't. I'm sitting here and I'm still in windsurfing. I'm still having to talk to people about bloody sails and all this stuff and boards and, and then the centre I worked at closed for December and January as well. So I was like, I'm not even getting paid for 2 months. What am I going to do? And I kind of started to realise, I'm lost. I literally don't know. I was like, I don't think this is fulfilling me. And for the last 8 years or whatever, I had been completely fulfilled in every way possible. And I was like, I don't feel like this job is... Again, it goes back to like ego, I suppose, but maybe in a good way of like, I'm better than this. I can do more than this. It all just pushed me down, and I just felt so worthless. By the end of 2018, I just felt completely worthless.
And what form did that take day to day? Did it affect your behaviour, your relationships with other people, how you kind of moved through each day and week?
It affected my relationships with my friends purely because they had no idea what was going on. So I've always been a real open book, and I feel like for those couple of years I closed the book completely. Like, as I said, I've talked to my friend, my best mate Ed, who I lived with in a little 2-bedroom flat. We hung out every day and been best friends since 2011, and he had no idea. And in retrospect, we talked about it, and he's like, I would never have known. And that's the most terrifying thing. best friend, knows me better than pretty much anyone. The only people that knew I was struggling was my girlfriend and my mum. And it all came to a head 2018 once I'd finished my work for that year. As I said, December, January we were closed. And I just remember sitting at my table looking at the sea in my lovely flat and looking at the sea and just sat there going, what's the point of even being here? What's the point? I was like, I got to the point where I was like, I could just go now and no one would know. Like, no one would know. I could just get myself out of here completely and nobody would know. And I don't remember why, and I think it becomes such a blur when you're that heightened, you don't really know. I can't remember if mum phoned me or if I phoned mum, but I remember being on the phone to mum and I kind of said, I was like, I don't think I want to be here. And 4 or 5 days later, I was on a plane up here. Mum was like, you need to be up here right now. So I came up here and I don't even think we talked it out the first few days. I saw my mates. And
Did you tell them?
No. No, because I was like, they're going to be even less understanding because they don't know me anymore. Or they don't... but then if I had told them, yeah, they'd probably have been like, well, of course I'm here and all this,
But then there's this whole thing, and we've touched on it quite a few times, this business of ego. And I sometimes wonder if, you've got to a point where you're not feeling great about yourself to begin with, and you're comparing yourself to other people by the sound of it. And then if you then put your hand up and say, actually, and I'd quite like to not be around anymore, I guess you can judge yourself for thinking that too.
Oh, yeah. So
that's just another thing to chuck on top of this big heap of stuff that makes you feel crap.
It's just snowballs. I always say it's like when a snowball starts going down a hill, it's like a cartoon. It rolls down the hill and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's what it's like. It's just a vicious circle in your head of, I feel worthless, but I can't tell anyone because that's going to make me feel even more worthless, because I'm then not only admitting it to myself, but also to the world. It's actually coming out of my mouth rather than just being in my brain, It's
ironic, isn't it? Because I would imagine, I don't know, but I would imagine a lot of people standing from the outside, looking at the life you had been leading, and you had a choice, of course, I guess, to go back to that life of travelling and teaching windsurfing. But standing from the outside, they might have thought, as I said at the start of this, that you had everything. I wonder if there was an additional pressure for you coming from sort of thinking, did you ever think, I shouldn't feel like this because I should be feeling... I'm not explaining it very well.
No, you are. I completely know what you mean. Yeah, I did. No,
did you feel guilty for not being happier, given you'd been living what other people saw as a dream? I don't think it was guilt. I think again it was. It felt like just an enormous fall from grace. Do you know what I mean? I don't think I felt guilty about it, but I think I felt like I've always been known as the one who, in the context of coming up to Scotland, he comes back every couple of years and he's got a tan and he's travelling off somewhere or other, and he's just, it's the quote, he's just living the dream. He's just living the dream. And then when I took the job down in the UK, all the other guys who I did the seasons with my age were all kind of moving to London, getting a perhaps more serious job that demanded a lot more of them, and I was still working in windsurfing. So again, it's, Sandy's still living the dream. He's living down in the beautiful south coast, and he's still putting a wetsuit on every day and going out and doing that. And in my head, I was like, I'm the only one putting a wetsuit. I was in the reverse thinking. I was like, how do I build something different? But yeah, I felt like I was completely stuck. Yeah, it wasn't guilt. It was a fall from grace. It was. I felt like I'd fallen so much further than perhaps other people might have done that have lived a more traditional life in their 20s, if that makes sense. So, how did you turn things around? Actually, I'm going to ask you another question before we go to that one. You said that you're quite an open book, and that's very obvious from the podcast that you do. So, even though you're an open book and sociable and outgoing, why do you think you couldn't be open about what you were going through?
It goes back to what I just said. I think it's like a physical manifestation of like how bad you feel. As soon as it leaves your brain and comes down and wherever, I don't know, comes up your throat and out your mouth and you talk, it's out there, you've said it, and someone else has got that information. And I think I was so terrified, like I said, of someone else realising, oh yeah, Sandy, oh, he's a bit down, isn't he? And I think as well, when you're that low, your whole opinion of yourself, of course, changes, but also of other people, and you start looking at them of like, if I tell them, they're going to be like, he's such a killjoy. I don't want it. I can't take that on. It's that it's that cool. I can't take that on. I've got a new job. I'm busy. I'm doing this. I'm going on holiday next week. I can't listen to Sandy thinking about killing himself. I can't do that. So you end up, again, it's the vicious circle. You end up going, but to be honest, and I'll say this for anyone listening that may be struggling, like that's couldn't be further from the truth. Every single person I've ever spoken to about what's going on in my brain has been the opposite of that. I'm not saying they've dropped everything and run to my side and baked me a tray of cookies to make sure I'm okay, but they've just said, talk to me. Honestly, and especially since I started, being vocal on social media with the podcast and things, I get messages from people I went to school with saying, hey, if you're ever struggling, please send me a message. Which sometimes I'm like, that's a bit weird. I haven't spoken to you for 12 years. But at the same time, you're like, it's unbelievable. All these people that at that time you think they couldn't care less about me. But actually, they do.
You managed to turn things around. Obviously, we're sitting here today. But you made quite a radical change in terms of your working life. Was that a part of you, I was going to say getting better. I don't know if that's the right phrase, really. But feeling better about life and yourself.
Yeah. That was the biggest thing. Like I said, I felt like I needed to take some ownership of myself, and I realised throughout all this, and at the place I was working, a role that I had also taken on was managing their social media. And it got to the point where I was enjoying taking the picture and writing a witty caption and uploading all the cool new products we got into the online store and posting about all that. I was like, I enjoy this more than taking people out on the water and teaching them. The light bulb moment came, and it was literally like someone flicked the lights on when I realised I had this moment of self-realisation of, this is what I now enjoy. So I went to my friend Ed, who had this job at this really cool company. I said, can I spend the day with your social media manager? He was like, yeah, come in. We had a chat, and I went in and I spent the day, and I was like, cool. And then I met this other guy who's a freelancer, and I went and checked him, and I was like, what do you do? I was like, is this a job? Can you just do this for businesses and on your own time and stuff? And he was like, yes, you can. So I went, okay, cool. And then the other light bulb moment, and this, I find it so hard to talk about this. And it's going to sound really, maybe it won't, no, I need to stop saying that. It won't sound pathetic because it was really important to me. Me and my girlfriend's also a windsurfer. We met, she's an instructor, an amazing windsurfer. And we went to Fuerteventura in July 2019. And for a week, amazing week, and I was still working at the centre at this point, and I'd really had enough by this point. And by this point, I'd also done all my research, realised the social media, I was coming to the climax of it, I suppose. And on this week, they were also running the World Tour event, windsurfing in Fuerteventura. They do the World Cup there every year for slalom and freestyle. I do freestyle windsurfing. And I got offered a wild card to compete on the World Tour, and I couldn't do it because I had to go home to my job. And I sat at Fuerteventura Airport in Burger King with Heidi, my girlfriend, crying, eating a burger and watching the live stream and watching my friends compete and also commentate and all this stuff. And the day after I got home, I quit. I handed my notice in. I said I'm leaving.
What I find really interesting in listening to you, I mean, quite a lot of what we've talked about has come back to, and correct me if I'm wrong in this, please do, Sandy, but has come to you, your best mate. You saw him go off and get this great job. You're seeing your mates there go and compete at something that you want to be doing. So there's a lot of comparisons going on. So I'm fascinated by the fact that you've ended up working in social media, which I think is the absolute kind of the mothership of comparison. It is the place where everybody goes and says, oh, look at me, look at me, look at my perfect world.
Yeah.
And I'll try not to get on my soapbox about social media, but I'm really interested to know how you feel about social media, and particularly its kind of good points and bad points in relating to mental health and things like comparison, because I think it's as I say, I think it's a place of comparison in the modern world.
Absolutely. So social media is everyone's lives through rose-tinted glasses. Starting off, I will say, comparison, there's a great quote, I can't remember who it is. Comparison is the thief of joy, and comparison is the thief of joy. I am awful at comparing myself to people. I do it all the time. Linking that to social media, I was never a huge consumer of it. I always viewed it as, and I think there's brilliant and awful bits about social media, but for me, working in it, I very much view it as, perhaps in a slightly different light, of I'm more of a, I don't think producer is the right word, but I suppose it makes sense. But, I'm putting stuff out there for these businesses and doing that. And also, when you work in it as well, I'm not on social media as Sandy. I'm on social media as whatever entity it is that I'm managing.
Yeah, for sure.
So when I go on, and generally now also, usually when I go on social media, if I go on my own account, it's to post me doing something cool windsurfing. My own Instagram is only windsurfing. And all the accounts I follow are only windsurfers and windsurfing. And even when I compare myself to other windsurfers, it's different, because it's like, oh, they're pretty sick at this. Sure, there's a bit of jealousy, but usually it's like, I want to learn that too. And then the podcast Instagram, likewise, is just full of people talking about mental health, and it's a very positive place. So I think what people need to realise with social media is that you are the pilot, not the passenger. It's so easy to look at social media and go, oh, it's full of toxic, blah, 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 blah. Just get rid of it, unfollow it. You don't need to see anything. It's like coming into someone's house and shouting about the wallpaper. It's not your house. You can't go on someone's Instagram and shout about what they're posting. And, obviously, of course, with the algorithm and all this, you're always going to see it. But it's so easy to take control of what you're seeing on social media. I think that's really important for people to realise.
Yeah, and I think that's a really, really useful way to kind of think about it and frame it. My big concern, I guess, comes to social media as a parent. I can't put that to one side, and I see young guys and young girls in particular, because I've got a daughter whose day is made or ruined by how many likes they get on something they've done on TikTok or whatever platform they're on. And that just, because we were talking about self-worth, or alluding to self-worth, and how we frame that and how we frame success earlier on, that idea of success being defined by a like, I find frightening.
Yeah.
And I was just very interested, so I'm just bringing myself to the party.
No,
I was really interested to see where it sat with you.
No, because it is a very valid point, and like I said, I know that you're a parent and things like that. So the way you look at it must be, complete. I can't speak to that. I hope to be a parent one day, and the only thing I will say, I feel like we've hit the apex, and now we're going down the other side now in terms of the damage of social media. I think because there's so much awareness of it now, and even things like Instagram taking like counts away, and many, what I've seen actually, an awful lot of the mental health accounts and things like that I'm exposed to with the podcast Instagram is almost none of them have a like count anymore. You can't see how many likes they've got and things like that. And I think social media, to be honest, is most damaging for young girls.
And you did say something which I put away in my pocket recently in your podcast. You said that actually social media, there can be lots of bad about it, for sure. But you said one good thing that comes with it is it has never been easier to reach out to a friend and say, you okay?
Yeah.
And when I heard you say that, I went, yeah, true.
Yeah.
True. I'll take that. Okay. Listen, we're going to come on and talk about the podcast, but just before we do,
Yeah.
if you're listening to this and it is striking a chord with you, don't forget it's okay not to be okay. If you need someone to talk to, you can text Mikey's line on 07786 20 77 55. That's 07786 20 77 55, or contact them via Messenger, web chat or Twitter, Friday to Saturday, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. And that doesn't matter where you are in the UK listening to this. If you want to talk to someone, Mikey's line is there for you if that's the route you want to go. Sandy, let's come on to talk about the podcast, the After Hours Lounge, and how that all came about.
Yeah. Well, the After Hours Lounge started a couple of months after I started my I suppose business. After I started this. So to give it time, I always feel a bit awkward. I always feel like I've got to give a time frame for everything. So I quit my job September 2019. I suppose I started doing work as a social media manager, everything like that, clients, things like that. That started in October. First podcast came out December 2019. So I remember having a conversation with Ed, who has come up a lot in this podcast. Shout out Ed. Ed does listen to my podcast, so I hope you're listening to this one, mate.
Hi, Ed.
Hi, Ed. But I remember having a conversation with him walking back from the co-op one night to our flat in sort of January, February 2019. So before I'd quit my job or anything. And I was trying to come up with ideas of what I could do within men's mental health. What I could do. I was like, how can I help? And I'd also recently started listening to podcasts. They'd come into my sphere, mainly just about films. And I went, well, I'll put it together. I love listening to podcasts. I like talking, and I want to do something about men's mental health. So it all just came together. The idea of the After Hours Lounge, I have always envisaged it as a physical location. So back in the day, I say that makes me sound 1,000 years old, but back in the day, I feel like men used to finish work and they'd all go to the pub together and they'd just sit and talk. Whether it was about football or work or their wives and their kids and where they're going on holiday, and they'd just talk. And they'd have 2 or 3 pints and then they'd go home. I don't know whether that was conducive to healthy relationships with their family, but that seems to be what men did. And I feel like men don't do that anymore. And I wanted the After Hours Lounge to be, that's where men come and talk, and you have a beer and you have a chat, and hopefully you leave going, I feel a bit lighter than when I went in, And that's the idea behind the After Hours Lounge, and that's, I suppose, why I've kept it. And I very much hope one day for it to be a physical location. I've scaled back the beer side of things, mainly because of my own relationship with alcohol. I don't really drink anymore. And I'm also fortunate the podcast is sponsored by a non-alcoholic beer brand, so I tend to drink them now. But that was the premise behind it, of just having people on and just talking to people and figuring out how they live and what they do. I'm fortunate enough, I've got so many amazing just friends, not even like people I can reach out, but friends that have just done a lot of cool stuff. I've got a mate who lives on a yacht with his girlfriend and his dog, and they travel around Fiji all the time. And I had him; he was my first guest on the podcast. I've had, and then obviously as the podcast has grown, I've reached out to more and more people, and then COVID, if anything, was a blessing in disguise, because Zoom happened and we realised that was okay. So I could suddenly talk to people in America and things. Yeah.
What impact has all this talking to people had on your ability to be more open about where you're at? Because as we learned earlier on, although you're very open, very outgoing, you went into personal lockdown when you were having problems.
Yeah.
So has the podcast kind of greased the wheels because you're much more used to being when talking about this stuff?
Yeah, 1,000%. The way I've always viewed it with the podcast is, if I'm going to do this, I have to lead from the front. I can't sit there and profess to be doing a podcast about mental health if I'm not willing to sit there on Instagram and film myself talking about when I was thinking about killing myself. I can't not do that. So I think I had a few words with myself. And to be honest, I still Like, this is the thing with mental health. It's not like a bruise on your arm that's going to disappear after 5 days. It's not even a broken leg that might be a bit creaky a few years later. Like, I don't think it ever goes away. And there's amazing, Tyson Fury has said this. All these amazing people that struggle have also said this. And I'm not a doctor, I don't know this, but from my personal experience, it doesn't go away. A few days ago, or a couple of months ago, I had a panic attack for the first time in ages for no real reason. And I can't go in the bar that I was in anymore. I was in the toilets having a panic attack. Like, it doesn't go away. But all you can do is figure out the awareness and the steps to take to mitigate the problem and make it smaller. So what was a bad day becomes a bad morning, becomes a bad hour, becomes a bad 10 minutes, because you have these things in place. And that was why, I'm sorry, I'm going back miles, but that was why I left my job as well. And I needed to work on my own time, because at that point, sometimes I was waking up going, I can't do anything today. I need to sit on the sofa and watch Star Wars. So I needed a lifestyle which allowed me that. And anyone out there thinking that that's not possible is talking rubbish. I had 2 months worth of rent in my bank when I quit my job. I didn't have money behind me. I didn't have thousands of pounds in my bank or a family that could support me. I was just taking a chance. And you need to realise that's okay. But in answering your original question, the podcast completely changed it. And I very much view the podcast as my own form of therapy as much as putting it out for listeners. It does help me just vent everything in my brain and get my experiences out.
There's one final thing I want to just ask quickly before we wrap things up. And that's that in listening to your podcast and from talking to you today, it's very clear that you have no fear of the trench. And what I mean by that is, I think sometimes when people open up and tell you that they're in a really bad place and they share their pain, as human beings, I think some of us will jump into the trench with them and some of us will turn away from that pain because it's difficult to deal with. You seem to have a capacity to be very open to hearing about other people's pain, hearing about people's, whether it's depression or dark places that they've been to. And I always call that the trench. And you have no fear of the trench. You're prepared to get in the trench and guddle around in the mud. And probably if you're a big guy, you'll be lifting people up over the trench.
Hopefully,
But I think that's a special quality because I don't think everybody has the ability to jump in the trench. And is that something you learned, or do you think that's always been a part of you?
I feel like it would be, first of all, thank you. That's a wonderful compliment. I feel it would be egotistical of me to say that that's something that I've always had, because it probably isn't. I think it's definitely been accelerated by the podcast. I think the podcast has just made me enormously empathetic. And it's also given me this awareness that no one really knows what they're doing. And everyone you walk past on the street is probably going through something or other. And it's so easy to say that. And I don't want to speak from a position of, ooh, look at me. But like having done almost 100 episodes of a podcast and talked to all these people from vastly different walks of life, the stories all start to line up. And you go, oh, we all do think the same thing when we get up in the morning. We are all nervous about the same things. So actually, to use your metaphor, if we did just jump in the trench and just help hoik each other out of it every now and then, it's just going to make everything better. So I to be honest, I put it down to the podcast. I think as a windsurfing instructor, when I was doing that, I was so singularly focused on what I was doing and living the dream that I don't think, and even my girlfriend said this about me the other day, she was like, you are so much more of an open human. You were so one-track mind back then, in a good way. It's not like I was doing anything bad, but I was so focused on what I was doing. And then I was lost at sea for a year or two. But now, like I said, it's like someone switched it from black and white to colour. And then through the podcast as well. I've never really been doing this lifestyle without the podcast. I had 2 months. And then I started the podcast. So this whole journey of, being my own boss and living this lifestyle has always been associated with the podcast. So I've never known it without it. And to be honest, I hope I never don't know it without it. Because I feel like it does make me a better person. And that's, as I said, the biggest compliment you could give me is you've recognised that, Yeah, I think it has just given me empathy to realise. I always do this. I always end up repeating myself in a different way. So yeah, I've given the answer.
Empathy is a very, very precious quality. Sandy, it's been a real delight talking to you. For those of you who are not familiar with Speaking of Suicide, what we do each episode is get Shona McPherson, who's a trained counsellor and mental health specialist, to reflect on some of the things we've talked about. Just before we hand over to Shona, a reminder of Mikey's line. If you or someone you know needs help or advice, you can text 07786 20 77 55 or contact them via Messenger, web chat or Twitter, Sunday to Thursday, 6pm to 10pm, Friday to Saturday, 7pm to 7am. Now here is Shona McPherson with a few thoughts for you to mull over.
Listening to Sandy there, it sounds like from the outside he looked like somebody that had it all. Young guy, travelling the world, really good in his sport. And yet, through a change of circumstances, as he tells us in his story there, this change in circumstances affected his mental health. And he found himself on an evening in his flat having suicidal thoughts, having thoughts like, what is the point in being alive anymore? And in the psychology of suicide, we talk about having risk factors and we talk about protective factors. Sandy, through his mental health, was at risk. The fact he was having suicidal thoughts is common and it is a risk factor. And yet he had a protective factor in his mum, in his relationship with his mum. And he was able to access that protection by having the courage, and it sounds like it was incredibly difficult for him, but having the courage to reach out to his mum. And thankfully from there on in, he got the support he needed and is at the other side of that story now, being a protective factor to other people actually through talking about mental health. And that maybe brings us on to the other point that Sandy was raising in that interview, that yes, social media can be detrimental to our mental health if we're just kind of consuming it less consciously. But if we can be more conscious and look at maybe sort of curating what are we consuming through social media and who are we following, that can actually be a massive protective factor to us. And also we've never been sort of more able to be in touch with people. So if you are struggling with suicidal thoughts at the moment or are feeling low and at risk in some way, you have got access, even if there isn't someone that you trust and that you can talk to. You could, Mikey's line, for example, use WhatsApp. They use forms of social media to reach out so that you can reach out to them. It's really important that you don't and aren't alone with these difficult thoughts and feelings. And then, finally, just to say, an overall risk factor in our culture, in our society, is still the stigma that exists around mental health, that is there around talking about suicide. And podcasts like this, having conversations about suicide, that is changing the conversation already. And the more that we can all do that, the safer we can be ourselves. So please, if you're listening to this, keep that conversation going. And thank you for listening today.
Huge thanks to Shona and all the team at Mikey's Line for the work they do. This episode was sponsored by D&D Paving Limited. Please do like, share and comment about the podcast. If you want to get involved by sponsoring an episode or by telling your story, like Sandy did today, do get in touch with Mikey's Line. Speaking of Suicide is an adventurous audio production. The music is Nana by Tom Ireland.